Hello everyone. This is update for March 5, 2023. Well, I guess it's update for March 5, March 4, 3, and 2, and days 375 of the war, end of the date update. So I'm going to start with China, then we're going to talk a little bit about Russia. This is more about strategic developments and events, and we're going to talk that switch to Ukraine, to what's going on in Ukraine. So let's start with China. There's more and more sanctions from the US that hitting China. In a way, it's a losing battle for the US. The reason it's losing battle is because in the US, in particular, in the academia, like PhD world, there are way too many Chinese sort of students or whatever you called, and because of that, you have transfer of knowledge without problem back to China. So whatever you do, you essentially it's a losing battle. It's probably slowing down significantly Chinese technology development, but nevertheless, it's a losing battle for the U.S. Then there are other news about China. The Communist Party decided that the GDP was going to grow by 5% in China in 2023, which is by itself is ridiculous to anyone who is yeah has a common sense that the Communist Party decides by how much it is going to grow. It kind of tells you how say insane that place is. No less, that's how it works there. And the more interesting part is that in the Chinese budget, growth of the military expenditure is I think 7.2%. So you can imagine that it's outpacing growth of GDP. So which really means that the share of the generated sort of, well, I guess it's revenue. GDP is really revenue. The more of it is going towards military purposes. So no surprises here, as you can imagine. The U.S., Europe, Australia, Japan, everybody is spending more on sort of preparation for the war. That's probably the best way to describe it. Then the actual absolute number is 225 billion US dollars. So if you really convert it into purchasing power parity relative to the US, it's probably comparable to US military budget and could be even more. So, as you can imagine, this is not a joke. Let's put it this way. It's pretty serious. China is definitely, if not totally on par, is very close to be on par with the US in terms of its military expenditures. Now, they obviously balanced by the fact that there's Japan, there is South Korea, there's Australia, and so on. So it's not sort of like one-sided, and this is what's really is significant deterrent for China for the moment, because they don't have exceeding sort of power. They still quite balanced, and especially if you include European Union, there's definitely you know not it's not it's not favorable situation for China. So they may continue kind of like playing this kind of game of, well, we don't know. We don't know what's going on in the world. We want peace in the world and so on. Um, so we'll see what happens. What happens there? There's also very interesting news out of China. Local, I think the province of China that's opposite of Taiwan is called Fujian. If I maybe I didn't pronounce right, but anyways, whatever the province of China that's opposite to Taiwan, they're actively testing civil defense system. Basically, the anti-bomb shelters and everything of that nature. So as you can imagine, that's not in preparation for peaceful life. Um, Now let's switch to Russia. There are interesting developments there as well. So first of all, there is Russian president's decree that essentially completely switches the entire economy into sort of into sort of military camp. So the essence of this decree is that if you whatever private company and you are tasked with military order for the Russian military, if you're not fulfilling it or you're not doing right, you as the owner will be sort of put aside and there will be installed sort of government sort of group or team of officials who's going to run your company to fulfill the order. So as you can imagine, this really means there is no private ownership of anything. This is just the war economy. That's pretty much what it is. Think it's very, everybody understands what this really means. This you're living in a military camp at this point. I mean, it was very clear before, but just becomes sort of legalized or like enshrined into the like legal system that that's what it is. Then, in terms of the Russian state revenues, they are really in difficult situation. They are cratering. Essentially, Russia lives off crude oil sales at this moment because natural gas is essentially dead or close to be dying. China is definitely not a help. Russian state government revenues are collapsing because essentially the only Russian viable export at this point is crude oil. Natural gas is essentially dead. So just to give you an example of how bad it is, the state budget deficit is about 3 trillion rubles or rubles per year for 2023, basically. I think that's around like 40 billion US dollars if you assume $75 exchange rate. So out of that, in January, the deficit was 1.8 trillion, which is roughly 24 billion US dollars. So out of 40, 24 already done just in 1 month. So as you can imagine, the situation is pretty bad, pretty dire, and it's going to get only worse. And um, because of that, there are some voices of dissent inside of Russia. There is an oligarch. His last name is Deripaska in Russia, and he was he was he gave a speech where he essentially said, we're gonna run out of money, uh, if not this end towards the end of this year, early next year. And so what we need to do, we just need to fire all of the you know um, bureaucrats. We need to fire so basically equivalent of police and so on, reduce all of this sort of military complex in Russia, um, which actually makes a lot of sense what he's saying. Uh, but at this point, this is just the initial sort of, let's say, you can kind of imagine this as just like um, rivaling group towards the current ruling group, political group inside of Russia. The interesting part about the Ripaska, he's the only, I think, remaining um, like oligarchs or people who influence the leadership in Russia, who was essentially instrumental in, let's say, finding and installing Russian president in 1999. So the idea, what happened is, if you remember, the previous Russian president Boris Yeltsin was alcoholic, had some problems with heart, and essentially was going away. And the the oligarchy in Russia at that time, they decided that the best way to rule Russia is through enlightened tyranny, which means that population is too dumb to rule, and we need to have what they call managed democracy. There's no such thing, but that's sort of their sort of name of how they try to rationalize what they're trying to do. And so, and they need someone, sort of some kind of puppet in charge of this enlightened tyranny system, uh, where they're really going to run it, but they will be sort of front person. And then they found current Russian president, and they saw that that's going to be their front person, and they're just going to do all of those economic reforms, which were necessary, and they were done, but they were done um, for the most part in the interest of this oligarchy that was running Russia. Um, and they were quite successful. And also, um, that success was significantly multiplied by the increasing uh, energy commodity prices. If you remember, starting from about like 2001, they took off, and it really helped Russia. That they had, like just an insane windfall of revenues throughout 2000s, and actually till to even later. So, anyways, so there is this group that essentially installed the puppet, and then the puppet decided that it's going to get rid of that group, which he successfully did. He marginalized everyone from that sort of old oligarchy group that installed him. Some of them left. I mentioned about that in, I think, May, April. Some of them left Russia and so on. And the only one that's remaining is Deripaska, who is sort of voice of dissent. So that's one center of power or future power in Russia. And the other one that's rivaling to it is Wagner mercenaries. So that's a different sort of approach than Deripaska's approach. So you already have two rivaling groups. Then, if, or I would say, probably when 1917 moment happens in Russia, this is essentially your two polar opposites that will be fighting on the opposite sort of lines. So this is what's going on in Russia. There's another interesting detail is that AliExpress. So for those who don't know, this is a Chinese online marketplace where you can essentially buy pretty much anything you want. This is for the entire world. So um, if you want to buy something directly from China and you don't want to use Amazon, you can just go to AliExpress and buy it there. There are a lot of problems there, but that's what's being used in the places where Amazon doesn't really work. And obviously, Russia is being one of those places. And so most of them tactical UAVs such as DJI products and Autel, and no, what's the proper name? They were purchased by Russian military on AliExpress. Not military directly, but people who support Russian military, so-called volunteers. And so those were purchased on AliExpress, and so now it's actually all of those purchases were blocked for Russia. So as you can see, for China, it's more important the relationship, maintaining remaining relationship with the West, are more important right now than supporting Russia. Even though there's interesting information is that China reduced its holdings of the U.S. Treasuries from roughly 1 trillion to about 180 850 billion US dollars. What this really means is that there is this decoupling or deglobalization of the world that I was mentioning many times, and simply China doesn't sell as much to the US, or was not selling as much over the course of the year. So they don't have as many excess US dollars, so they don't basically send them back to the US. And so they have to reduce their holdings of treasuries that they already have and sell them, basically. So that's another reason why. That's not the major reason, but that's another reason why the interest rates probably will remain high, because there are fewer sort of international sort of supporters of the low interest rates. Related to this is pretty bad economic data coming out of South Korea, where the export is has dropped, I think, 7.5% year on year. This is a fifth consecutive months of declines in export, and export is lifeblood for the South Korean economy. So that's really clearly sign of, the global economy is not doing well. Let's put this way, in a very simple way. And then in the US, there was also economic data came out that, uh, well, I think it was on Thursday. I don't remember, Thursday or Friday, but the data, basically the most important one, was that productivity was showing that it grew 1.7% quarter on quarter, but the unit labor cost grew by 3.2%. So this what this really means is that system is still in out of balance, and it actually again started to go in a sort of, in the trend is becoming again negative and out of balance, because your unit labor cost should ideally be under the productivity growth, and because the way to basically get increases in salary is a simple way. The best way, the way you, anyone or we all get increases in salary is because productivity grows, right? So productivity is really the how you increase the pie, and then how the pie is being split between the labor and capital. That's a different question. But you cannot have, or you can, I guess, have labor getting more than actually by how much the pie is growing. But the point of Federal Reserve to make sure that capital gets its return, right? So they essentially, as a system, they their goal is to protect capital. That's what this really means. That they need to increase interest rates and create excess labor and reduce the labor costs for the capital. So basically, the how much the labor gets will have to kind of like go down and be under productivity. And so this is what they will continue sort of. Basically, this is the war they're waging. They're waging the war against redistribution of this pie from capital to labor, essentially, because they're kind of like the guardians of the capital as a system. Despite all of the sort of formal kind of like, oh, we are there to contain inflation and create maximum employment. That's all just sort of, how to say, boilerplate statements, but they're not truly reflecting what they are after. So again, what this really means, there is another push, there's more need in continuing increasing interest rates, which is, I mentioned before, that interest rates will have to go higher before they will get to the point where the distribution in favor of capital will be maintained. That is actually, I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. This is just how the system works. That's all I'm trying to explain. The problem with this approach is that there is a problem with the labor. particularly in the U.S. There's just simply um, sort of not enough of it. So in order um, to basically reverse that distribution in favor of labor, you need to really increase the interest rates tremendously, which can create also on its own, uh, you know, depression type of environment in U.S., which can lead then social unrest and so on. So you can get into really like death spiral basically. So this whole situation can easily get out of control. So so as you can see, the situation, economic situation in the Western world is far from poor. It's actually pretty terrible. Similar situation in Europe. There is also information about the increasing number of bankruptcies among European companies. Like it's just jumping off through the roof. Just it started recently, so this also creates tremendous problems in Europe, and so the things are just going to get worse there. I mentioned this many times before. This is a result of the, uh, I would say, like failed and completely um, terrible economic policy and and the war against the conventional energy. And basically, um, I would say not even the war against it's more about even philosophically a problem where um, Europe goes away from freedom of choice, to be more of, you know, similar countries similar to China, similar to Russia, where, you know, it's all top down. And simply for the world, there's no need for another um, top down system. There are plenty of them in this on this planet, and China the most being the most prominent. And so, from just evolutionary perspective, the reason Europe and let's say US existed and the Western world existed because it offered alternative of bottom up system. And if it turns into a top down system, there's no need for its existence as a whole. And that's a in a way, West is also facing its own existential crisis. Because, and this is what I mentioned before, that it's sort of lost its own ways, and if it's not going to regain it, it's definitely going to lose um, the fight with the East, which is, we can define it as a top-down system. So that's a sort of update on the situation, I guess, in the world: Russia, West, China, pretty much everywhere. Now let's go back to Ukraine. So situation in Ukraine is obviously also deteriorating, getting worse as a whole. Um, that although situation with energy supply is actually almost perfect, there is no blackouts anymore. Everything is more or less stable, electricity wise. Um, so that's on the positive. Then, in terms of this provocation in the Bryansk region of Russia, so nothing came out of it. However, it looks like the reason for that was to declare formal war against Ukraine. However, it looks like as a result of some internal debate, internal infighting in the Russian top, the decision has been made not to declare the war and kind of like let it slide. So that's what's going. That was most likely what was going on with that provocation that I mentioned. That was, I think, happening on, on the between March 1st and March 2nd. Now let's go back to the sort of walk through the front line. We're gonna do it in a clockwise fashion as always. And the situation along the state border is, let's say, tense, remains tense. There is exchange of artillery fire from both sides, so things are very tense. Um, and as I said before, um, there is something brewing in this. I guess I can call it triangle between Sumy, Kharkiv, and Belgorod. We'll see if something comes out of it or just sort of eventually will disappear. Now let's jump to the North Luhansk front line. Things here are sort of in balance. No, no Russian advances. Multiple Russian attacks in typical locations here in this whole forest area, and then sort of more in here in the middle to dismantle Ukrainian bridgeheads here. Now let's go to North Donbass front line. So, in a summary, probably the best way to describe the situation is that um, Wagner Group is exhausted, as what I mentioned before on the first, uh, and they basically cut off from its sources of strength, which is recruits from the Russian prisons, large and unlimited supply of weapons plus shells. Shells are okay for now. However, recruits situation with new recruits is the same. Sort of not nothing has changed. They basically deprived of oxygen. So as a result, the ability to continue the way they used to is gone essentially. So, and as a result, there is no real meaningful advances by Wagner mercenaries over this 4 or 5 days. It's almost like the situation is sort of very interesting, where uh, the they almost squeezed Ukrainian troops out of Bakhmut, but at the last moment they just don't have enough strength to make the last push, last hurrah, to make the last sort of advance. So far, Ukrainian troops are holding, and doesn't mean that Ukrainian situation is stable and great. No, it's terrible as well. So it's in a way the fight of who is going to be in sort of more terrible situation, who is both sides are extremely exhausted, who is basically more exhausted relative to other side. That's just the best way to describe it. The level of exhaustion of Ukrainian army is extremely significant. So what this really means is that even uh, Wagner mercenaries cannot make this last final push. However, the damage that's being done to Ukrainian army is big enough that it will force sort of orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut of Ukrainian troops. There are rumors that some of the units already being withdrawn over past 2 3 days. I don't have any confirmation. This is just more on the rumors, but it makes a lot of sense because um, basically, when or if Wagner mercenaries will get reinforcement and will renew the push, the jump can be really quick, and significant Ukrainian troops can be trapped. So it makes a lot of sense to start orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut to new positions, to kind of regroup and continue the fight. So basically, you kind of like trading territories for time and for exhaustion of the Russian troops. And you trading your own sort of troops for the Russian troops. That's unfortunately what's going on in Ukrainian army. So basically, there's nothing better than trading lives of Ukrainian soldiers for the Russian soldiers. And as I mentioned before, it's a losing battle for Ukrainian side because simply Ukraine is 3.5 times smaller. You can even say at this point 4 times smaller than Russia. So there is no way Ukraine can win war fighting in this way. And the most ridiculous is instead of Ukrainian military command, instead of realizing the problems in Ukrainian army and reorganizing it, what they decided to do is just they blame the soldiers that like lower that the morale is low, that they're not patriotic enough, and all of this, emotional nonsense, basically, and or emotional garbage that they try to basically make soldiers feel guilty, I guess, and they instituting, uh, I think, the pledge that every soldier needs to repeat. I think that's like a pledge of patriot or something like that. But basically, absolute garbage and nonsense. That's just kind of highlights the deep embedded problem within Ukrainian both political and military top, where the problems are very clear, and the problems are actually in the top itself. And instead of resolving the problems, they actually try to blame, you know, people at the bottom and make them feel guilty and kind of sort of, you know, use propaganda to force them to die for no reason, right? Instead of actually fixing problems with the supply, with the number of weapons, and so on. And this is not gonna work. That's a whole. That's a, you know, that's why propaganda never works. It's just a lie, and lie means death during the war. And so, mm, this is what is this is sort of called a strategic response by Ukrainian military command and political command, which is going to fail. And for that reason, once Ukrainian troops withdrew from Bakhmut, uh, it doesn't mean that things are fine and going to be stable. If Wagner mercenaries are going to sort of regain the access to resources that they used to have, the problems will for Ukrainian army will renew. So same way the Konstantinivka can be lost and Kramatorsk can be lost. So this is here the next top big sort of items are Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. So if this doesn't change, this is they're gonna be lost. Probably will take 4, 5, 6 months. But if again, if Wagner mercenaries are gonna regain access to the resources that they used to enjoy, things will continue, will repeat, and that's a whole problem here. So now let's just kind of quickly look. So this was I didn't even update for March 5 situation. Essentially, it hasn't changed. The only probably maybe update is that looks like Ukrainian command decided to withdraw completely from the eastern bridgehead of this Bakhmutka river, which was essentially basically dead, or basically it was extremely small. There was no point to be there. Otherwise, everything is sort of stays, I would say stable, but in a it's stable uh, in sort of, let's say, in a bad way, sort of, let's say, stable. Despite there were like reports of blowing up the bridges and everything, the whole point here is that uh, Ukrainian military using just basically field straight going through the fields, even they are it's total mud and all of that, but they still managed to get through that. They used the field roads and stuff like that, which makes the logistics extremely difficult. And that's another reason why the units here are suffocating in terms of the supply. So even if Russian troops don't have enough resources to kind of like close this gap, eventually, slowly but surely, this will suffocate Ukrainian defenses here, and Ukrainian military command will be forced to withdraw. It's just question of time. If Russian troops had resources, they would squeeze Ukrainian troops in, let's say, 2, 3 days, 4 days. Otherwise, it's going to be could be drawn out for another 10, 20 days. But essentially, the writing here is on the wall very clear. Is that Ukrainian troops cannot hold on to to Bakhmut, and it's not the fault of the troops. It's really the problem of Ukrainian military command and political command. So this is just kind of quick, kind of like walks through. So as you can see, essentially, the situation since February 27 hasn't changed actually much. And even, I mean, I guess 25th there were still advances by Russian troops. 23rd is more noticeable, and this is 13. So most was happening basically between like 23rd and 13. This is where the fate of Bakhmut has been sort of sealed. I mean, I guess it was sealed long time ago, strategically, with the problems in the Ukrainian army. So again, as you can see, uh, Wagner mercenaries trying to attack everywhere. Now they a little bit switch the direction. As you can see, they're trying to advance west to kind of create even bigger threat here, and so kind of like psychologically force Ukrainian command to withdraw from Bakhmut because it's becoming extremely straight salient, as you can see. Now let's move to central Donbass front line. Things here are active, but pretty bad for the Russian military. No successes here, or no. I mean, if you don't call success like advances of another 50, 100 meters, there's essentially nothing here, and the resources that's being sort of wasted and spent here are completely unsustainable for the Russian side. So, and again, just want to highlight and contrast difference between the, call it, Soviet army and more normal common sense army, which is Wagner mercenaries. And so you can see huge difference in outcomes and results. So for now, I would say situation here is more or less stable. Now let's finish with the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are quiet for now. No new Russian advances so far. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye bye.